expressed in the following are those of its participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the producers and the Six Talk Podcast Network. Also, the following contains mature material and mild language, which may not be suitable for all audiences. Discretion is advised.
And the podcast is now on the air for this Friday night, August 14th. A couple 1020. This is episode 22 of the Anime Roundtable version 2. Just a quick reminder, if you have any questions, comments, or hate mail, animeroundtable@gmail.com, Twitter and Instagram @animeroundtable, animeroundtable.com for our show notes and past episodes, and the Discord. Mike Nicholas in the captain's chair at 6 points. James Austin, Kevin Ng, and Mohammed Shamarki remotely as they have been the last 3.5 months, pointing the ship in the right direction. So where do we start tonight?
Putting us on the spot here, Mike.
Okay, I'm leading people on. First of all, this is the only time I'll bring up Yakuza in the entire episode. I finished Yakuza 0 when we finished up taping 2 weeks ago. And I've just been spending the last 2 weeks leveling up the characters further, just to see what else I missed. And I'm thinking about finally starting Yakuza Kiwami sometime in the next day or so, but who knows on that.
What was your favorite minigame in Yakuza 0?
Admittedly, I had the most fun with the cabaret challenge. So doing the hostess club episode was hilarious. And I think it takes on another layer because of who I know the hostesses are played by, if you know what I mean.
We'll need to talk about this off the air.
Anybody listening who doesn't know what we're talking about, just Google it. You'll see a lot, guaranteed. I mean, is there any other punchline to that?
Wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
That's good enough. But I'm looking forward to eventually getting a chance to play the other games, for that matter. The other thing I have to mention I finished up within the last couple hours, I finally finished up Terrace House Opening New Doors, the Karuizawa season, the one that aired before the controversial current season. And I have to say this, in many respects, I could start to see where some of the seeds of eventually all the backlash that happened in the present season would happen. But having said all that, the phrase, hindsight is 20/20.
Yeah.
I mean, I mentioned I kind of clamped down on the commentators, how the celebrity commentators like Rina Trindle or you or Yota Yamasato really did not help some of the matters. But when I think about that too, it's just sometimes, like I said, that's their job to sometimes be a little critical. Ultimately, it's up to other people to think of the context of what they see on the television and try not to get too carried away, and understanding that getting carried away has other and unintended consequences, and that's ultimately part of the story with Hana Kimura. There's a lot more to it, obviously, though.
Mm-hmm.
But I will say this, and this is as an advertisement for at least the Opening New Doors season. Towards the latter stages of that season, one of the people who come in, one of the house guests who come in, is, how would I describe him? Pretty easily becomes one of the more likable characters to have ever graced Terrace House. And he's the antithesis of just about every other person who has ever appeared on it. He's not the best looking guy, certainly not a model, and he already had a certain degree of fame because he's in a well-known band, but just comes under his real name this time around. So as I said, he's the opposite of just about every other cast member who had appeared on the show to that point. And to be fair to the guy, he was quite honest as to why he was on it. He was looking for love. And in it, I ended up seeing the real life embodiment of. You remember the manga Love Roma?
Yes, I do.
Yep.
Essentially, that's what this guy is. He's the real life main character from Love Roma, whose name right now I forgot. Such an earnest, honest character. And you end up cheering for him in his pursuit. And not to blow anything about how it ultimately went, but it's at the very end of this particular series. And
that was such a good read.
Love Roma, yes, that was a hilarious read. And this guy reminded me of him. Cynically speaking, they may have had him on too, because around the time of his appearance, the leader of the band he came from, he was embroiled in a scandal of some sort. I think an adultery scandal. He had cheated on his wife or something to that effect. And funny enough, that friend or that bandmate appeared quite a bit in those final episodes himself. And he acted a little contrite as well in terms of having to give advice, saying, maybe I'm not the best person to give advice. But I think some reviewers cynically thought it was the band and the leader specifically trying to save face too. So this was a PR stunt. But I think the presence of this band made the final episodes a little bit more interesting and kind of broke some of the tension that had also started to develop during that season. And that's the tension that also kind of spilled over in many respects, or the related type of tension that ultimately would dog the following season, at least the tone. But it was a fun watch. I will watch the last season. The other part is, and this is another foreshadow, as this season ended, they said, we're going to have another season. We can't go without seeing another season. Obviously, that next season did happen, but I'm not totally sure you could say that now, that there'll be another season of this after, with all that's happened. So, as I said, you watch this with a hindsight is 2020 type attitude, knowing what would eventually happen to the franchise later. If you're a Terrace House fan, that's sort of the tough part about watching these older episodes. There was actually a podcast that was dedicated to reviewing the show and being a fan of it. I will try to make it a point to put a link to that in the show notes when this episode goes up. So those are two of my thoughts already, just to start to break the ice. What about you guys? Anything of note this week or within the last day or so?
I started reading a manga called Kaiju #8. And
Monster.
Yes. Right. It's a newer Shonen Jump series, and it is in Shonen Jump Plus in Japan, so it's in the same magazine as Spy Family, which is another very popular series that came out from that side of Shonen Jump as of late. And I think they have a winner here. The main character is pretty likable, and the way that they're setting up the series right now, I really think it can go far. Like,
okay,
there's a bit of a twist in the beginning, which I won't explain, but I think they have a good cast of characters, and I like the premise. It's because it starts off as like you have the people that kill the kaiju, and then you have the people who clean up the messes after the fact. And so it kind of plays that angle for a little while. And yeah, you don't really think about that when you watch any like regular kaiju film.
That's one way to put it.
But it becomes, it looks like it's going to be more than that in short order.
Okay. Kaiju #8, was it?
Yes.
Okay. That sounds...
Yeah, it's on the... It's on the Shonen Jump app, and most of the chapters are free. First 3 chapters are always free, and then the latest 3 chapters are free, but because chapter 7 came out this week, chapter 4 is not available for free anymore. But you know how it goes.
Yeah, I think I do. Thanks a lot, Kevin. Mo, James, do you want to add anything you want to plug at the moment? Or should we just get right to it?
I think we should get to it, right?
James? You're
The
never...
only thing I was watching is I've gotten back into a show that came back from COVID was the Noitamina, the Millionaire Detective Belts Unlimited. So that's
Which
been
I've
fun.
heard of that, yes.
And that
Like,
one, the creator, it's interesting because it's based off a novel by Yatsutaka. I can't pronounce the last name. It's just escaping me. But he had also written Paprika and The Girl Who Leapt Through Time.
oh,
And
yes.
some of his books had been obviously translated and brought over to North America. Now, Millionaire Detective wasn't, but this is the first time seeing it, so it's interesting, and they've definitely modernized it because this was based off a book written in the 70s, and technology wasn't quite the same back then. Basically, it's one guy, they're 2 cops, and one is very rich and is using money to solve all his problems, where the other guy is rough and tumble, regular cops. So, and they're going off each other, so to speak.
Is it on Funimation?
Correct. It's on Funimation, so I've
I've
been
been
watching.
seeing a bit of a promo for that. I mean, I've seen them really putting on the press.
But they did 2 episodes, I guess, in April. Then COVID hit, they stopped, and then they started up again at the end of July. So it's been fun to watch. I think they said they were going to try to get a dub for it as well. And it's an Aniplex one, so who knows how they're going to release it, if it's going to be an Aniplex Funimation combo, I guess.
It could be. Well, you know, we're going to be talking. Well, we're going to be talking more Aniplex and Funimation and their parent company a bit later on.
But
Okay, let's get right to it then. The meat of the episode. Late Saturday night, Kevin alerted me on the Tatsuya Matsuki story, simply saying, quote, "Time for me to step in your shoes a la Rurouni Kenshin." So the story writer of Act Age was arrested a week ago on suspicion of performing an indecent act with a minor. He basically confessed to it when police figured out it wasn't an isolated incident. And the fallout has been both spectacular and fairly expected. Act Age has already been canceled, among other things. So right now, the first thing that comes to mind is, I think by default, this weekend for Mr. Matsuki is already better than last weekend. But let's talk about this for a little bit. Kevin, this I could sense kind of tore you up a little bit. Am I right in saying that? First of all, let me just, okay, I'm going to give you a deep breath, and let me just quickly say this about my memory of the Watsuki thing. Watsuki was caught with child porn, I think in 2017, was it? I think, if memory serves me right, it was 2017. I didn't know about it actually until long after it had happened. And remember, this was just as I was starting to dive back in to keeping up with the anime world to some degree and eventually bringing back this podcast. But really, I didn't know about it until long after the fact. And by that point, it wasn't really much of a story, but the fallout had long happened. This one's a little bit more raw, though, I think, for you. Or maybe I'm assuming too much.
It's a little raw for me.
Go ahead. I mean, reactions. Give me a thought. Where to start here?
I was gonna save most of this for if/when I was going to do a solo recording, because that was my intention. But
okay, well, do you want to save it for that solo recording, or do you want to at least preview it here?
Well, to put it bluntly, I was not happy, and I'm not happy that he went and did that and sabotaged not only his own career, but Shiro Usasaki's career.
Yes, that seems to be
The
where a
artist.
lot of the sympathy is for, actually, since the official news of the cancellation happened a few days later. So basically Monday, I guess.
I would say of the weekly titles, Act Age was my favorite series.
Currently running, quote unquote.
Well, not anymore, but
Well,
when it was
that context, yes.
when it was running weekly, it was my favorite series. I read Shonen Jump alphabetically for the sake of tracking.
it just dawned upon me where Act Age kind of sits on the Western alphabet.
But if I was reading Weekly Shonen Jump based on what I wanted to read right away because I liked it, Act Age would have been first, regardless.
Well, Act Age is first in, at least, as I said, the Western alphabet too.
Because I would say recent favorites in my magazine, or in the magazine, would have been that at 8 Gravity Boys and Mashal. And I do like We Never Learn as well. And of course, One Piece. But Act Age really stood out for having a female protagonist that had depth and had a story behind her, was not over sexualized, and
No comment
actually
there.
there were several female characters that were prominent in that series, and they were not one-dimensional. That's exceedingly rare in Shonen Jump.
So move away from the archetype.
Yes, and it stood out for also not being a stereotypical action series. Now, the characters do fight in the sense that, they're performing with each other, and it's the moments while they're acting and in between different scenes is when you see some tension and you see, the battle, so to speak. But at the same time, with much of the cast and much of the staff between different shows and different performances, there is a sense of camaraderie there. And it's kind of rare to just see like a whole group of people, being friendly with each other or being more or less like pleasant with each other, but still being competitive and wanting to be the lead actor or actress, or telling each other like, I'm going to be the one who's going to be the next great persona or actress or whatever. Like, there, of course, those elements are there, but it really stood out. Like, having all these things together, I feel like it did resonate with some people, and it was gaining momentum. And now that's no longer the case.
Well, first of all, let's sort of go back to Miss Usazaki. We mentioned one person to really feel sorry for. Act Age, as its fans know, is actually a two-person act, so to speak. It's both Tatsuya Matsuki, who's the story writer, and Shiro Usazaki, who's the artist, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Correct.
And that's where the most of the sympathy is, right? And James kind of hinted to me a little bit that there was some tension there.
There was how do I put this? I don't know where I've heard this, but rumor has it that the two of them didn't get along that well.
And that's
That was
what I
always
was
the
hearing
case.
too, and that she unfollowed him on Twitter at some point this year.
Unfollowed him.
So there's breadcrumbs to be sure. That's for sure.
I mean, once again, we're taking the hindsight is 2020 look at this. There are other things that Like this was an uneasy partnership, seemingly, or at least not the most warm partnership.
And how about this? Maybe she, probably working with him, probably saw more things that us as the general public wouldn't see. And now the veil has kind of been unfurled, so to speak. So
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it, especially since the scandal broke. There's been other not so flattering thoughts given on Matsuki's habits. So our News 24 kind of published an interesting one.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I don't think I'm aware of this.
Manga writer arrested for groping wanted to make a series stimulating for guys who like young girls, quote unquote. Wait, interesting little headline. I'm going to put that in the chat notes for you right now, Kevin, so you can probably peruse that as we're talking about it.
I guess, as we said, the other one that a few people are making note of online too was his one author's comment. I'm not sure which Jump magazine he put it in, but talking about how I just need a bicycle I can socially distance on and all my hobby needs will be met. And now people are looking at those type of comments and thinking, holy smokes.
Yeah.
Yep.
So there was seemingly a pattern of at least odd behavior, if not suspicious or bad.
And the crazy thing is, you just wonder how you think people can get away with this, because they had CTV or CCTV cameras everywhere, and that's basically how they caught him. They went through that CCTV footage.
And that's where they figured out, oh,
And
this guy's
then he
isolated.
made the infamous comment, of course, where he basically says that, oh, here it is. It says, there's generally nothing incorrect when he talked to the police. That's what he
Yeah, that was
made.
a great line.
And you think about that and you're like, wow, of all the ones we've seen, the scandals from Jump or any of the others, I don't think we've seen anything as blunt as that. That's what I'd call a slam dunk. You don't get sympathy after that.
He admitted it. He admitted it essentially.
The only thing I can say is he got slam dunked all right. I think and I'm saying that for the third time. You know what name comes up when we talk about other people who kind of got hurt in the crossfire or kind of got screwed up? For some strange reason, I think of Louis C.K.
Whoa, come on. No,
it's a stretch. Well, no.
Oh, now Muhammad's talking.
Yeah, now Muhammad's talking.
Yeah.
Hear me out. Hear me out. This is sort of like, this is the offshoots, and I know this is a stretch because you know I'm good at stretches, Mo. Bell and Studio Ghibli. Louis C.K. at the time his scandal broke, and I forgot exactly how many years ago that was. I think it's 2 years ago, maybe 3.
I thought it was a bit further than that, yeah, but maybe
at least 3 years.
At least 3 years. Yeah, 3 or 4.
At least 3 years ago. When that scandal broke out, he was in the process of creating and making an animated series based on his stand-up work. And as the scandal wrapped him up and chewed him up and spit him out, as you might have expected, that animated show got canceled. And a good handful of people who had been working on that series ended up losing their jobs. And around that time, we heard there were like articles and interviews with some of the people who were on that production about how much the scandal had hurt them. So that's who I think of when I think of somebody like Shiro Usazaki in the fandom to some degree too. That's the parallel I start thinking of, because Act Age is kind of unique in the sense that it's 2 people involved with it. There are titles that are here that have more than one name to the byline, right?
Yeah, and sometimes a lot of the ones for manga they're probably based off a light novel that had been released before, something like that. And so this one was a manga first and foremost. So that's kind of an interesting thing in itself, that
Mm-hmm.
it started off as a manga and it was a joint effort between two people.
Utena was the first title that I became aware of where it was a joint effort. Chiho Saito Kunoiko Ikuhara. And so this concept is not totally new to me. It's been a while since I was made aware of a title personally, or knew about a title personally. So if one domino falls, a lot more end up falling behind. And that's the thing about these type of scandals too. Like a lot of legacies can get hurt in the who had nothing to do with it, and that's it. Okay, you want me to give you another stretch, Mo, on somebody who got hurt by somebody else's scandal?
Do it. Let's hear it.
Okay, Jeffrey. I think his name was
No, come on, don't say that.
Who do you think I'm about to refer to?
Jeffrey Epstein.
No. Jeffrey Owens. He's the guy who played.
Oh my god!
The guy who played Sandra's husband in the Cosby Show.
Oh yeah, I remember that one. Yeah.
Remember when they caught him a couple years ago bagging groceries, and somebody wanted to out him for that? What is he doing? Doing all that type of stuff? Wasn't he an actor? Wasn't he an actor in one of the most beloved sitcoms of the 80s and 90s?
Well, people need to eat.
Well, yeah, and that's his line. People need to eat. I'm not ashamed of it, but he also admitted since the Cosby Show, he hadn't gotten a regular acting job.
Mm-hmm.
At least one that had lasted longer, like anywhere close to the gig he had, and it was really just the odd appearance type thing until the later seasons on the Cosby Show. And at best, he could hope for any royalties from re-airings of the show, but then Bill Cosby ended up getting into trouble, and nobody wanted to air the Cosby Show. So much for the royalties. And it's not as if this other actor was getting anything out of it. To start, anyway. Getting too much. So as I said, scandals, they hurt more than just one person. They hurt more. They really do hurt. So I'm beginning to think, what will happen to Mr. Matsuki in the future? That's another part of the conversation we had, Kevin. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Can he lay low for a little while? And can he return? I'm wondering if these times, the whole Me Too era, will make that a bit difficult. For reference, Watsuki was able to return, although his Kenshin continuation was canceled in North America. It's still going.
It's still going in Japan.
And then Toriko's creator got to come back as well. So a lot of them have been really lucky on Jump, but I think this time, Jump's going to take a hit if they do what they've done before.
Kevin, the other name you brought up was Mitsutoshi Shimabukuro, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's
who in 2002. That was a long time ago, 18 years ago. He got caught embroiled in a scandal, as well. Jeez, but he's kicking around again. 2008, he returned.
Yeah, so he created Toriko, which became a massive hit in Japan. Not so successful here, but it was, it went for a good 40-something volumes in Japan, and hasn't really done anything since. He's done the odd one-shot.
Mm-hmm. Didn't he have a series that also ran until recently, or a couple years ago?
No.
Like a couple years, that ran for a couple years?
I don't think so.
No.
Okay. I thought I read that in at least the wiki. Although it's the wiki.
Not to my knowledge, at least.
Okay. But this one could be different.
Well, okay, maybe I won't do that solo recording after all, since we're going to just talk about it all now. But in this case, Matsuki was not as established. because Act Age was still a little over 2 years old at this point. 2.5, give or take. Whereas with Watsuki,
of course, remember the whole. Well,
Kenshin,
that was established. Kenshin was an established title. You can't really cancel it and try and erase the whole history because it was a tier 1 title.
Kenshin came out at a time when like several big Shonen Jump series were ending in the early to mid 90s, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one of their flagship titles during the 90s, and it's a beloved title in Japan. And let's not forget that the Rurouni Kenshin movies, the second set of those movies, were set to come out as well, or at the very least were in the works. I forget the timeline.
They were set to come out this year. Those have been delayed because of the COVID pandemic, but they were set, yes.
So once again, we talk about money because the Kenshin movies are massively popular in Japan and cater to the general audience, the masses. I don't think Shueisha would have wanted to risk all that money going down the toilet. And because Watsuki is, is well known in their stable, they probably felt the need to protect him.
That's
And
a fair.
and
Go ahead.
we also have to realize that at that time in Japan, child pornography was still legal. It's
Okay.
disgusting, but it was still obtainable. And in the case of Shimabukuro as well, we have to stress that he was unaware, or allegedly was unaware, that she was a minor.
That scandal, yes.
And she was a sex worker, and it was how do I put this? It was two people consenting to what they were going to do. So
feels like the first episode of Californication.
So in that sense, like you can, while it's skeevy as hell, you can understand Shimabukuro. You can see that there's like a devil's advocate point that you can make there. It wasn't as if like he picked the girl up from like a park or whatever.
Yeah.
And the other thing too is his series at the time was in Weekly Shonen Jump, so it got canceled. Whereas with Watsuki's new Rurouni Kenshin manga, it was in Jump Square, if I'm not mistaken. So
not the major, not the big one, not the flagship. Okay. Well, got a couple seconds here. Do you have a thought where you think this will eventually go? For like, what's next for Mr. Matsuki?
I don't think he comes back.
Like, period. None of this. A couple years down the road, we'll hear from him again. Nope, don't see it.
I don't see
it. Yeah, given what we explained and saw, that the evidence is pretty much against him, and he has admitted it straight to our faces, and
irrefutable.
I'm also wondering if there's a degree of contriteness to that admission. I mean, we haven't heard him actually talk. It just doesn't sound like he's apologetic about it.
Well, I guess some of it is we're looking at some of the other statements we saw way before that, and some of the ones you mentioned, like from his Twitter and the one that he made in his author's comment in Weekly Jump and stuff like that. And when you kind of add it all together, it doesn't lead to a good picture of how do you bring this person back, because I don't know if he's contrite at all. And even if he does, quote unquote, come and become apologetic, how seriously should we take that? Because I wouldn't.
Okay. Well, Kevin, I'm sure if there's something else that comes up, you'll let us know. Oh, I guess we should also acknowledge Miss Usazaki. What's next for her? She's young.
Poor woman.
Yeah.
Poor
Yeah, she's
woman.
23 or so. So I think she was really young when she began. But hopefully
22.
they can help her. Okay, so younger than I thought, even than that. But still,
I think that's the one we can expect to hear from again.
The one thing is hopefully they can train her and maybe she can get some ideas, maybe to get better at writing and stuff like that, and maybe launch her own manga or something like that. Because obviously on the art front, she's talented. It's just a matter if she wants to do some other things. Maybe she wants to do her writing skills. So the sky could be the limit for her because she's still young and she's got talent in one area, and maybe just work on other areas. And
We can
people
only
will be
hope.
there to support her.
We can only hope.
Because I'm sure some people will like to see what she does next, right? So
No, I think
at
a
least
lot
she'll
of
have
people do.
some
And
people that'll lend an ear, and she can maybe take that somewhere good, hopefully.
she has the support looking at just perusing online. After the cancellation of Act Age, all the sympathy was with her, I think.
And
So
just to sum it up, for general information's sake, the last chapter, which I believe is chapter 123, I don't remember if it did hit the magazine in Japan, but it did not come out in English on
I think
the Weekly Shonen Jump app or Manga Plus. Viz has dropped it. You can no longer buy Act Age on Right Stuff, and there was about 20 chapters or 18 chapters that were supposed to be backfilled, translated as the volumes came out. That's not going to happen anymore. And if you want to read the last chapter, you'll have to read it illegally.
Yeah, because it came out in Japan, but they said they're not going to release it here in English. They've been pretty much, you're done. They weren't going to give anything more, and it's too bad, as we said, for the artist. But it's like, and they just started physically, as they said, last month in July and stuff like that. And as you said, they had started on the digitally before that. So,
and for people who are unaware, I've seen a lot of talk saying, "Oh, why can't they replace the writer?" Well, it doesn't work that way in Japan in most cases. So, because Matsuki is one of the creators, you can't really just replace the writer like you can in a Western comic. And
there's a rights issue. Could there be a rights issue, or is it just
it could be that, and then it's just a thing of getting the series and the plan off the ground. Because the one I think of when I think of this issue, and it's a different thing altogether, is High School of the Dead, that manga. Because unfortunately, in that case, it was the writer Daisuke Sato, I believe, it was him that passed away, I believe. And then the artist that was illustrating for that one, Shoji Sato, for that one, I believe, I was doing that. He said that he tried to think of a way and all that stuff, but he just couldn't figure a way to continue the series and stuff like that. And
that was
he
it.
might have been able to do it because he has his own manga and stuff like that called Triage X that he was doing on the side, and now that's his main thing instead of also doing High School of the Dead, since the writer in that case had passed on. But he waited and he tried and he said he just couldn't do it. Like, sometimes that comes into effect too, right? Like, I guess it's that melding of two forces, right? And if one of them is gone, sometimes you just can't, there's a vacuum.
Okay.
And also,
last thought.
It's interesting to see. Well, I guess it makes sense because even if the writer could have been replaced, Usazaki would have had the first right of refusal on whether or not she would even want to continue it in the first place. And clearly she didn't. And there is no mention of act age on her Twitter account now. If you go to her Twitter account, all it says is, I'm a manga artist.
Well, let's look forward to her upcoming work.
I hope Jump treats her right.
Yeah.
Or maybe we'll see her in another publication. Who knows?
Hopefully Suisha treats her right then. 2 thoughts before we end the segment. Mo, you're there?
Roger that. Still here.
Thank you. 2 quick thoughts. 1, Kevin, if you still want to do a solo mini on this one, and on my mind, whatever we call it, do it. It's just it'll nicely summarize what we just talked about. Nothing wrong with that. 2nd, I'm going to quote Diamond Joe Quimby when he toasted his nephew in that infamous episode of The Simpsons. Happy birthday, young nephew, and may all your embarrassments and scandals be private. With that in mind, let's take the break. When we come back, well, we did hint we want to talk about Aniplex and Funimation. Well, more specifically, we want to talk Sony. Rhymes with bony. It's the Anime Roundtable on the Six Talk Podcast Network. Okay, just quickly. Yes, the actor's name was Jeffrey Owens. He played Elvin on The Cosby Show. And he made news a couple years ago when he was just caught with the groceries. Good story with him. He handled that like a champ because some people tried to drag him through the mud in the media on that one. It's not a scandal, but it's somebody else that should have looked silly. Anyway, the podcast now continues on this Friday evening, August 14th, 2020. Nicholas, Austin, Ing, Shamarki, once again, continuing the conversation with you online via the Six Talk Podcast Network, official podcast Anime North. Those Cosby Show, Louis C.K. examples in the first block was a bit of a stretch, wasn't it?
Yes. Yes, they were.
I thought it put things into some perspective, or it gave some food for thought on what happens when these type of scandals happen.
For whatever audience we do have, Mike, I think the Cosby Show could be dating us, because how many people can even remember that?
Although Cosby himself, people were well aware of, I'm sure.
No, of course.
So, second segment, let's get on to the other big topic we want to talk about. On Sunday, James sent me this interesting article from the Nikkei Asian Review about Sony's updated strategy going forward. Perhaps it wouldn't come as a huge surprise that Sony now wants its animation operations to become the fourth pillar of its entertainment business, along with music, games, and movies. And how nicely that snowballs. Just as quickly as I saw this article, news came out through various outlets earlier this week that Warner Media is now looking to sell Crunchyroll for at least $1 billion US, although seemingly that price tag has been bumped up on Sony when they were given the first look at it.
Yeah, it's like we saw with Funimation, of course, where they were given these higher numbers than what it actually sold for to try and get people interested and get the tires kicked, so to speak, because they were doing 1.5 billion to Sony, and that meant that their subscribers were worth $500 US per subscriber, and that was way more than what they had previously valued them at. I think in previous reports where it was at $400 per subscriber. So who knows? Like, it's whatever the market will bear, right? But it'll be interesting to see who they are able to kick the tires with. Maybe Comcast and Universal will try to get into the anime market in the US and into that sort of market, because remember, that's the one everyone thought Funimation was going to be sold to, because they had quite a few executives that were hired that were from Universal, and they were the ones, I think they actually are still distributing Funimation's physical discs, Universal, which is still interesting considering they're now Sony. They didn't get
No, it's interesting that, I never thought of how Universal could play out in this scenario. That's an interesting one. Let's go back to that. Well, where do we want to start with this story? Do we want to start with the business strategy side of it, or do we want to start with the more recent events in this with Crunchyroll?
You
Where do
mean
you
we're
want
not
to
going to
start?
start? We're not going to start when Crunchyroll is a pirate site and now they're evaluated at $1 billion?
$1 billion.
No,
I feel
no,
like that's
no,
the
Kevin, that's a lie that people told their children. Don't believe that. Pretty sure when I was giving them money, it was to the scanlators and to the fan subbers. That's who I was giving the money to. They were nice people.
Yes, they were. When you were giving, especially if you did give them money. Let's start with the article, James, because that was fascinating. I read that just before we came on the air tonight.
And some of
And
that, I think, ties into this being a big year for Sony and them revving up for the PS5. And many people have been talking about that, right? Because they were silent for so long till about June when they just blew the lid open of, okay, these are the games. This is what the PS5 looks like. And here we go and stuff like that. Now we still don't have a price, but I'm sure that will come soon. But it all ties in together and stuff like that, as we say.
yeah, and there's that buzz concerning PS5. Even Xbox is kind of on board with that.
Yeah, I think they've just given up this entire generation cycle.
Could be.
Well, they're going for a different
when the head
strategy,
of
that's for
Xbox
sure, because they're like, you can play it on your Xbox One and you can play it on your Series X. We don't care.
Mm-hmm.
So it feels like they're blurring the lines, whereas Sony's saying, this is the PS5, this is the next big thing. But the funny thing about it, too, on that thing, speaking of Sony companies, is on the technological side, because remember, Sony is still selling tech. So the new TVs they're selling, they were looking at some of them and even the ones that may come in the fall, and it might not take full advantage, some of their TVs, of the PS5, which is kind of ironic. You know what I
Well,
mean? Because they're saying, oh, you got to do HDR, you got to do the 4K, you got to do this and that, right? So.
UHD,
But
ultra high
it's
def.
kind of almost like the old, remember when it was like we were doing 1080p and we were doing 720p and most people didn't know the difference and people are like, well, which TV am I getting, right? It could be almost that situation just to take full advantage of the tech you're getting because it's going to be expensive to get a PS5 and you want it to look the best it can, right? If you're getting something that expensive.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a fair statement. I mean, you had me thinking, and I guess this is a good way to start this part of the story. Sony and how it's evolved over time, especially over the last 25 years. Basically, the lifespan of the PlayStation, because Sony for the longest time was a consumer electronics company. They still do them. It doesn't seem to figure as highly as it used to. Still there, but movies are now that big a big thing for them. Over those 25 years, everything under that entertainment umbrella became more the thing for Sony. And kind of moving parallel with it was the animation operations. Back to Rurouni Kenshin. Rurouni Kenshin figures a lot into the way I look at it, into this discussion tonight. But Rurouni Kenshin, to me, that was when the anime came out for that in the mid to late 90s. It was the first time I was ever exposed to the fact that Sony had its own production house for animation. I think it wasn't their first, but at the very least, it was the first time I knew about it. And then they tied it in it tied in with a lot of other aspects of Sony's burgeoning entertainment side.
And then you have the music as well, too.
The music,
So
of
you
course.
have that.
And how far back can we date Sony's movie aspirations, especially when they bought Columbia and TriStar?
I would say, yeah, that's when it started was the early 90s, late 80s, but especially in the early 90s because they bought all those old movie makers in
in
California. They
Hollywood.
started ramping up getting the content, stuff like that, and getting people that knew that area from California. And
PlayStation.
then you have what happened between Nintendo and Sony in regards to the CD add-on for the SNES and how
Yes,
that
coming back to
fell
the
through because the head of Nintendo back then, of course, basically
Yamauchi.
did not want to give away all that money to Sony on the discs and stuff like that, and just pretty much in front of them said, "Guess what? Deal's done. We're going to Philips," and that left them scarred, to say the least. And so there were a lot of internal discussions, and there were a lot of people against going into the gaming industry and stuff like that on their own. And
But
the father of the PlayStation fought hard and was a very unique character in that company, very not like most Japanese engineers or business people or anything, and fought to say, we can do this and let's go F Nintendo up and show them
and
what
they
we're made of.
and over the last 25 years, in many respects, that's what's happened.
And they wanted to show the tech and all that too. So there's a lot of multi-thing, but they came out guns a-blazing, and they've rode it ever since. Now, sometimes that can hurt them, and we've seen that at the beginning of the PS3 era and stuff like that, where they said, here's our tech, but you had to pay for it. But who knows how it'll be going forward, because they definitely learned from that and were humble with the PS4, and then they got a lot of people in, that's for sure.
And going parallel with all that was the less. It was more on the content side, and then the slow shift started to happen away from their electronics, like their televisions, like their Walkmans. Like, I'm doing this podcast wearing a pair of Sony headphones, and that might be the only major Sony electronic piece I hold, PlayStation aside, right now. So that's what Sony on the electronics side has sort of become over all these years later. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's the way the business has evolved. But and the other interesting part is how you had each of these entertainment pillars, and that's a theme that's brought on in the Asian Nikkei article. You have now 4 entertainment pillars, but in some ways, those pillars kind of tied into each other. In the PS2 era, like you hinted at, James, the PS2 era, that's sort of where the DVD really started to take
And
off.
that's
And
what I was saying, is they kind of had this vision. I know that Bill Gates talked about it too, that you'll have that Trojan horse, that box in your living room, and it'll do pretty much everything for you. And then for a lot of people, that's their phone and stuff like that now. But you can still get that out of a video game system, whether it's your Xbox or your PlayStation,
yeah,
because you
that's
can do
Sony's
your
thing.
streaming, you can do your gaming, you can play your movies and stuff like that. And as we alluded to on the PS2 for anime, like when a lot of people were getting their discs and stuff like that back then, the big thing that people were playing it on was the PS2 and stuff like that. That's what was helping them drive those sales and stuff like that, because people had a PS2. And it's funny thinking back to it, that if you were testing discs on all these things, probably they would go to a PS2 first, because that's what most of your customer base would probably be playing it on. And it's funny thinking of Read or Die was the one where I remember Manga Entertainment released that way back. It was like 2002, and that you could play it fine anywhere else, but it had an issue playing on PS2s. So
I
a
think
lot of people had problems.
Fashugi Yugi, I think, had a similar issue.
Well, I
Kind of
vaguely
funny.
remember this.
So, but
And then,
that's
of
to
course,
illustrate the point. And then it shifted a little bit, obviously, to the smartphones in the last 10 years.
and we also had the Blu-rays. So the PS3, even though the start wasn't great, it definitely probably helped to get people into Blu-rays and stuff like that too. Though I'm
And then
not sure, as we said, with the new Ultra Blu-rays, the 4K ones, even though that's going to be supported on the next gen systems, obviously I don't think it'll have the same effect, because now we have streaming and play now, of course.
Right, and downloads. And fast forward things, and then the phones, of course, which Sony hasn't been as big on the technology side. That's belonged to Apple and Samsung and maybe a few others.
But they can
Huawei.
still use their tech knowledge, as they said in the article, to help out some of the companies below them and that people they have bought. Like I know Funimation, for example, some of the good things about buying that for them was they got really good at dubbing stuff and short order and stuff like that and doing the simul dubs in English. And so using that workflow was a benefit for them. But now with COVID and stuff, they had to kind of scale back. But they were able to probably ramp up faster than other people because Sony probably helped them on getting that equipment, getting that technological know-how, maybe to help them do more remote recordings and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Let's fast forward this now, and your technology line is actually well taken because of recordings and stuff. But let's go. I have a more cultural slant on that. But there was one line in the article that especially caught my attention. I'm going to read that right now. Sony has traditionally given group companies a long leash when it comes to content and services, but this approach has resulted in some inefficiencies as its units tend to buy overseas businesses without coordination. And first of all, my first blush has me thinking once again back to the whole missed opportunities with Bell and Crave and the whole Studio Ghibli thing. And you know how I like to stretch because I did that earlier in this episode. And in many respects, I still stand by that, the stretch I made with Bell in relation to that. But only because that line kind of illustrates my feelings. No coordination. Sony wants to reel in their lack of coordination. And I think it's that lack of coordination I think could hurt Bell at the very least.
And we saw some of that. They mentioned in the article, and we had talked about the weird buying, and we're like, oh, that was a different division. That's why that happened, because Aniplex bought Madman, which was the Australian anime distributor and stuff like that in 2017. But then, of course, it was Sony Pictures Television Networks, the American unit, that bought Funimation and stuff like that. And it wasn't until last year that they kind of coordinated the whole mess together. And they're all under one umbrella, and they also added Manga UK into the mix too. So.
And Wakanim, the French
yes.
provider.
Yep.
Kevin, Mo, did you want to say something?
Well, I mean, the Sony bit makes sense, you know. Everything's all vertically integrated, right? I mean, it's just one extension of their already monopolistic arms, right? I mean, producing anime fits right into their games, which is into their movies, into their music. It all kind of just works, right?
It all connects. And coming back to the whole technology thing, because you talked a bit about, dubs, actors with technology, because remember we talked culturally about how Japanese voice actors are always in the same room doing their recordings, and because of it they also play off each other. In times of COVID, it's kind of tough to do, so they're trying to improve the technology to try and replicate that routine. But in some respects it's also starting to come a little bit closer to the way Western dubs are done. So it'll be interesting to see how COVID eventually figures into the way Japanese seiyuu will eventually go about their work. In many respects, maybe that's the one thing that Western voice actors are able to adapt a little faster to. Or rather, they were more quickly able to adapt, because in some respects, that routine was already there.
Yeah, there definitely was routines on our side that would be better in this type of situation compared to Japan, where they were all together in a group and that. But the other thing I'm thinking of, another part of the article from the Nikkei review, and it's a very key thing too for Sony, is that they talk about it this way. They said, Sony is not looking just at the entertainment side of anime, but the residuals too. Successful productions generate loyal fans, making the intellectual properties that rivals can't exploit related to merchandise, movies, games, music, can turn into vast revenue streams and stuff like that. And basically, we talk about that in other areas too, like for example, in games, you can think of that for Nintendo, where people kept on harping on them for that, and now they're getting into it. they're taking all that intellectual property that everyone loves and then exploiting it in other revenue streams and stuff like that. And it can be a
Well,
long tail if you do it
well,
right.
maybe it's a bit of a wonder it took them this long to realize it. The anime and manga merchandising side has always been a thing. That's a essential part of the fandom and the ecosystem.
But I think on a bigger scale, that's definitely for them because we know obviously we're only so big in anime, but to grow it to an even greater degree, I think, to make it more mass market and stuff
That's
like
where you
that. If
think,
they find the right property, like it's the Fate or the Demon Slayer is what they're looking at. Demon Slayer is the one they mentioned in the article because it's
which,
the most recent.
but that also ties into maybe one other part of this whole thing. Remember when we said, or when I said, during the PS2 era, the video games tied in with the movie side, but now, 20 years, almost 20 years later, the video games are tying into the established fourth pillar a little bit more, the animation side. Remember, there's that argument, or at least I make it, that there's a lot of overlap between the consumer base of both video games and the animation.
I would say that's true. And I think the anime boom that we saw in the early aughts and the late 90s when it started for North America and in the West, some of that comes from the early video games, the NES and the Super NES and stuff like that. Because remember, when we thought of games and great games, we thought of games from Japan and we got to learn that cultural DNA so that as we got older, and you search out more things, it's like we were more accepting of anime and other things that had that cultural DNA.
And on top of that, 20 years, once again, coming back to that same consumer base, those consumers are now 20 years older and might have a little bit more money to spend in the process. Mind you, maybe they're 20 years older and also have families, and maybe that's where most of the money's going too. But the money is there if you are able to make them want to spend it on you. And they've kind of nurtured that over time.
100%.
So this change in strategy is an attempt to further cash in on that. And then maybe hope that those people, those consumers who they nurtured 20 years ago, will nurture it to their kids. Okay, let's change gears and then look at the other side of this story and come back to Crunchyroll. Where do we start with that?
It's a pretty straight play that AT&T basically cares
Needs
about
money.
one thing. Now, COVID kind of threw a loop into it, and I think that might have accelerated some plans because when they bought all these companies, and that includes like Warner, Crunchyroll, we got DC, we got a lot of things tangled in. They have a lot of debt they have to pay off. And
Yep.
so anything profitable, they're going to either sell off or they're going to cut down on certain things. The only sacred cow I think that is there is HBO. And HBO is all they wanted from, I think, Warner or for whoever it was before, because that's what they think is going to drive their business and drive people, I guess, to their platform because that is the content provider they want and think is the most profitable.
HBO and basically
HBO Max,
Warner,
of course.
and use it to
and HBO Max
and
will be their streaming service, probably.
You know what this is reminiscent of?
Go ahead.
This reminds me of when Navar owned Funimation. And at the time, correct me if I'm wrong, but Funimation was the only profitable division of Navar.
Yeah, because they were distribution and stuff like that. And so originally when they bought them, it's like it kind of makes sense and stuff like that. But then, as you said, it kind of unraveled as we went into this digital age, as they say.
And remember who bought Funimation back? Gen Fukunaga.
But he had a few billionaire friends, Kevin.
Yeah.
And guess what? They bought it for even less than what they
Exactly.
sold it for. I was like he's got his lucky horseshoes. I tell him that. It's like I've one con I remember someone was making this point about that similar thing, and I said, you know what? You shouldn't really be bitter because all the power to him. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Like he's the only one in the anime industry in the U.S. that found a way to come out the other side clean and get some money out of it. And some of it was
Which
luck,
Not
rare.
and
even
some of
some
it was
money.
hard work.
Not
So
even
Yeah,
some
like
money. A
anybody in
lot
the
of
anime
money.
industry making money, which is at times seemingly at times a novel concept.
And the big thing was he started off with luck because he got Dragon Ball Z, and
Yeah.
that is probably the most profitable thing imaginable and still generating profit. It's the evergreen of all evergreens, to say the least. And then as they grew it slowly because remember, it's like you had Yu Yu Hakusho and Dragon Ball for the longest time. That's what most people knew. And then it wasn't until I want to say closer to 2003, 2004, they start to branch out into other animes
Fruits
that people are
Basket.
like, oh, yep, Fruits Basket, and then a few other ones. I think Kitty Grade was one of their other ones they
Yeah, they
first
did
did.
pretty well with Kitty Grade, if I recall.
Yeah, and then Spiral as well. And so
Oh,
people,
really?
they started
Spiral?
reaching out to the heart. Yeah, that was one of the first ones. So to reach out
It
and
did
started
well? Wow.
releasing other. Well, no, I don't think it did well, but it was one of the first ones they did outside of the mainstream
Yeah.
and to reach out to, I guess, the more core fan. And then it was interesting that after that, the next big one that really did well, of course, was Full Metal Alchemist.
Yep. The
So when
second
you
batch
add
out,
that,
which
it
they don't
all
have
worked
anymore.
out to them because that's how they got that valuation for Navarre. And so they get that. And then, of course, as you said, you got the evergreens and they keep trugging along. They have the corporate backing. And so it all went well for them. And then the SH hit the fan, as we know, with Jenny on. And then with the partnership ADV decided to do. And so that meant they could pick up the crumbs and they just got stronger on strength on strength, right? So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, add in a couple of other developments, and Funimation's basically where they are now.
Yeah,
So
and there's
coming
still
back,
things obviously they had to grow as they continue as the things change. You talk about streaming platforms, you talk about dubbing and all sorts of things. So
yeah, coming back to the whole Crunchyroll story, and once again, AT&T took an interest in HBO and basically Warner Brothers to help because of its library to help drive HBO Max. And how many streaming services does AT&T and Warner Media have under that umbrella? Is it just HBO Max, Crunchyroll? There's a few others,
there's a
right?
few others. Like I think Boomerang is in there, which is kind of like the Adult Swim and Cartoon Network stuff. Like there's so many things. And then remember, I'm not sure where TBS and TNT factor in there too. Like there's so many things. You know what I mean? The Turner Broadcasting word that factors
Which
in
is
as well.
part of the whole thing. But to settle a few debts, they have to sell off something, I guess. And the red-headed stepchild or orange-headed stepchild known as Crunchyroll, I guess, is being put up for adoption.
Well, of all the specialized streaming services, you have to agree that it has been the most profitable and stuff like that compared to a lot of others.
Yeah,
So,
sometimes
Yeah.
you have to sell value to get value, I suppose.
mhm.
So that leads us, like you just brought up, obviously Sony is a possibility since they're brought up as a possible buyer. Mind you, they'll probably have to pay more for it.
And that would be ironic if that does happen. But I'm sure on the Japanese side, they would pray to God that does not happen because remember when Crunchyroll and Funimation had their partnership, so to speak, what happened was licensing costs and all that went down because people weren't competing with each other. So the revenues for the Japanese went down, which probably does not make them happy. And then the other
Yeah,
thing is,
we talked
if
at
they
length
come
about
together as well, they may try to get on more committees and try to accelerate, of course, their original productions and stuff like that. So that won't help them either.
kind of like when we talked about Netflix and its involvement
Hmm.
in that. Okay, so talk about possible suitors. Netflix was a possible suitor. Maybe, maybe not.
I see.
Unlikely.
I don't see. I don't think you would think of it that way for either Amazon and Netflix. They'd be out of the equation, though. If they were, they'd probably kick the tires at anyone. But of course, as we said, Universal Comcast
I
is
never thought of
definitely a suitor,
Universal,
since
and
they
that's
tried at one point, of course.
but they have their Peacock service that just
Yeah,
started.
I was gonna say Universal kind of has all their money tied up. I mean, uh, don't think any other major streaming platforms are gonna willing to take this on, right?
Yeah, that's it. That's where it gets interesting. So what happens? Like,
Yeah, it'd be
are they,
hard to say how you want to sell it. That's the question mark. So,
well, the better question is it going to be sold? Because maybe they're putting this out there, but who knows which
and
way this will go.
even for example, as we say, if they do sell it to Sony, and we know Sony is integrating all their things together and stuff like that, if they're related, for example, the anime sphere, then they would have to work again with Funimation. Supposedly, there was issues between both camps, between Funimation and Crunchyroll, when they were working together and stuff like that. There was like, it was working, but there was still tension between the two groups, so to speak. They didn't exactly work together as well as people would hope.
Well, that's
You know what I mean? Like, it's like two groups and they have their own drama and stuff like that, but you never know. It's like, yeah, you can keep working together, but at some point you have to be on the same team and playing from the same page. You know what I mean? Because sooner or later something will break the camel's back.
so that's why you think there'd be issues with a possible Sony purchase.
To a degree, but you never know. Things can be ironed out, and different people and different faces come in and out of companies all the time too, right?
Yeah.
So
Well, yeah.
that's a small thing, but something to keep in the back of your mind and something like that too, and would give them food for thought if they were thinking of even considering a purchase on the Sony side, because they'd probably talk to the people on their side to see how they feel and stuff like that, because they would put it under that brand for Aniplex, Funimation, and all that stuff.
It would almost be, well, not quite, but it would almost be like reuniting Matsuki and Ushizaki, or maybe not.
And then the other thing is, what would happen to your subscription price? Because if there's less competition, maybe they'll think, you know what, maybe it's time to hike up our subscription fees again.
I know. See, this is the thing. Sometimes this is the dark side of monopoly, or one option, right?
Yep.
Like sometimes we complain about competition because now if we want a certain exclusive, we have to like go with subscribing to 3-4 different services. But then sometimes here's the pendulum coming the other way.
And the other thing is, you don't know if they're going to offer that free version and stuff like that they have before, which they did for Crunchyroll and for Funimation at present. Because remember, you don't get a free version with Amazon or Netflix. You got to pay to play.
Okay, this is the last name is unlikely, but I want to bring them up anyway. Sentai.
What about them?
I guess that
they do not have the money.
They don't have
They
the
do not
money.
have the money. Even
like,
with Cool Japan giving them that money, that those millions of dollars is just a drop in the bucket, as we know, because we saw what their first offer was to Sony, and we know relatively what their value was before on the books. So there's no way they can even get close to $1 billion, even if they did payment options.
And what has that Cool Japan money done for John Ledford? Really? It makes you wonder.
It likely got him more interviews on NHK with Aki Shibuya. He was a commentator around the time of the Kyoto Animation Fire a year ago. At best, it's exposure.
But was that the clout he really needed to build his business?
As I said, at best, which really doesn't go very much.
And the other thing, as we said on that side before, is they can only get so many things now. It's like, what would happen then? They would probably not be able to get many of Funimation and Crunchyroll combined together again, because they're just getting the scraps. But they could look at what Discotech's doing and maybe look at some of the other catalog, and they have done that, but it just doesn't seem like they've been as gung-ho about it to make it a move going forward. And they had tried SD Blu-ray, and it feels like they just gave up on it.
Yeah. So
So I'd see
interesting
it
to
as
see.
a definite no-go. It's like I wouldn't even
Oh yeah.
have them in the
Well,
conversation,
I just
unfortunately.
want. No, I get it, and really, bringing them up is just to fill time. Although we fill enough of that already. It'll be interesting to see what happens, though.
Well, I'm
Like,
just happy that Sony didn't think it was worth it. Because we
well,
need the
I get the feeling.
competition.
Yes, but I get the feeling
You
they're
know
not.
what? I think we should be
Yeah.
realistic with our options and just say the pirates will buy them and they'll all live on Pirate Island.
Arr. Okay. Before we go tonight, and once again, we will keep up with both the stories we talked about this evening. Before we go tonight, a couple things. One, a quick shout out to Sean Alpha, the host of Geek Eire, who I spoke with just before we came on the air tonight. He asked me to not be shy in mentioning that he is going through something really interesting. Sean Alpha, or his real name, Sean Burke, is a former moderator on Facebook back in Ireland. And right now he's in court. He sued Facebook over, well, he was a moderator on Facebook. That's the short version. And as a moderator, sometimes you're exposed to some difficult material, to say the least, and it's taken a mental toll on him. If you know the story about being a moderator on things like YouTube and Facebook, you are exposed to seeing videos which will never make it and should have no business being on such platforms, but somebody has to stop it. And those that do, well, let's just say sometimes they are scarred by seeing them in the first place, and that's where Sean is right now. He is claiming he has suffered some serious psychological injuries as a consequence of being exposed to explicit content while working for Facebook. He is in a high court in Ireland right now seeking some damages. And we'll put a link to his podcast because he says podcasting to him really helps him mentally. He's a fan of this show, and the Geek Eire guys, as we mentioned in past episodes, they did panels at Anime Lockdown a couple months ago. Sean, thanks for listening. Hope you're feeling better. There you go. He asked me to mention it, so I want to do that as a favor to him. Second, as a few of you already know, last week I did put up another On My Mind. Mohammed likes to call them minis. That's a good way to describe them. A little mini shot. And this time I told the 5-minute story of Fumio Kuno's little masterpiece, Town of
Town of
Evening
Evening Calm, country of cherry blossoms.
Once again, it was about a family during the Hiroshima bombing 75 years ago. The anniversary was last week. The 75th anniversary was last week. And I thought, among all the stories that were out there concerning the bombing, manga wise, I think this one might have been one of the more underappreciated ones. So I thought, let me tell you a little bit about it. And James reminded me as we were doing the pre-show meeting for this a couple days ago that this isn't Kuno Sensei's only work on the topic. And I think Seven Seas has published a good chunk of her works since then, too.
Well, no, it was just the one in this corner of the world, and that was based on the fact that the movie came out over here from Show Factory and stuff like that. But that movie, interesting enough, and it was from, I believe, the same director that did Black Lagoon. He was from Madhouse. But it was interesting. That one, I believe, they had to crowdfund some of it and really work together. And they spent years getting it done because no one really wanted to put up the money to get that type of story out there, which is really crazy to think of it because that was a really touching story too, for in this corner of the world. and it was a similar thing, but that was during the war before and then going to just past the bombings and stuff like that. But as we said for the one you're talking about, Cherry Blossoms, I don't know if it's still in print, but if you see a copy in English, Last Gasp was the one that published it.
And
And
Last
it was,
Gasp was mentioned?
yeah, it
As
was
Barefoot
Last
Gen?
Gasp, I believe. Or is it? I'm just going to double check. Yep,
No,
it's
it is Last
Last
Gasp.
Gasp. Sorry, sometimes I've
And
heard some people call them Last Gasp, so I'm like, no, it's Last Gasp.
Yes.
And
and
for
they
Last
also
Gasp,
have
they published it and it was great. I was hoping that they would because it's been years since it's been in print, but maybe one day they'll reprint it and stuff like that because I haven't heard about Going on Prayer or whatever, but they have reprinted the more famous story of that Hiroshima bombing and stuff like that, Barefoot Gen, which they've republished many times before. So hopefully they'll give some love to this one too again.
as one reviewer said, Cherry Blossoms told its stories in whispers rather than screams. Barefoot Gen is a scream, to say the least. And hopefully, it'll encourage others to do little short minis in the near future, Kevin. Actually, there's a few other things we have down the pipe, and hopefully the listeners out there will have a chance to look forward to them. Anyway, that's just about it. So let me repeat this one more time, Kevin. If you have any questions or comments or flames or hate mail, animeroundtable@gmail.com is our email address. We're on Twitter and Instagram @animeroundtable. AnimeRoundtable.com is our website, show notes, and archive of past episodes. Yes, we are in Discord, technically. And also, if you're listening, please give us a review on wherever you get your podcasts, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and the like, because the reviews will make sure other people get a chance to listen to this show. And any positive feedback, well, any feedback probably would be good.
It'd be appreciated, yes.
Yes, it really would be appreciated.
Especially if you rate us 5 out of 5.
Yeah. Well, there you go. Happy now, Kevin? So I had to repeat it again at the end.
Did you even say in the beginning?
Bubbles.
I lost track.
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. I did.
Okay.
Tiny bubbles in my wine. There it goes. I made that joke about Don Ho. And yesterday would have been Don Ho's 90th birthday. He's a famous Hawaiian singer. And his signature song was called Tiny Bubbles, but at a point towards the end of his life when he performed concerts, he kept joking, we performed Tiny Bubbles at the beginning, and then by the end of the concert, I forgot whether or not we performed Tiny Bubbles, so we performed Tiny Bubbles again at the end.
Oh, you know what I wanted to say, actually.
Okay, say it, and then we'll say goodnight to everybody.
We've done more than 100 episodes combined, if you factor in the old era and the new era.
Yeah, that's right. You did mention that before I hit the record button tonight. I lost count, to be quite honest with you.
As did I.
We've been around for that many episodes, finally?
Well, okay, so officially, there's 77 episodes from version 1, and this is excluding the one that you never put up when Neil and Adam reunited one last time. Then you have what? This is going to be up, and we have 21 episodes.
22 episodes now.
Yep.
With this.
And then you can include the Don't Get Me Started with Neil, when Neil came back for one episode. And
basically, we started version 2.
And then you have the intro episode in April, which was the episode 0 of version 2, I guess, which was when that was when I recorded for the first time, and then you did the one in February of 2018 with James. If you count that as well.
Basically to reintroduce ourselves, right, James? It had been a while. by that point.
Yeah, no, it
So
had been a while, so we just did something to get us back in the groove, as they say.
Well, I tend to think of it less on number of episodes and more on number of years. It's been more than 14 years since
Yep,
we've been
over
so
a
we're
decade.
probably at like 102, like 102 or so now, give or take, depending on which ones you want to count.
Yeah, and then if you count everything else, we're over 110 recordings altogether. Maybe get close to
Yeah, with the
120.
digest and whatnot.
The digests and the solo shots. So we're closer to 120, I believe, altogether. Hey, happy to have done it. Hopefully, the listeners have had a hoot listening to whichever ones they wanted to listen to. I'll be so shocked how many have listened to all of them.
At least some
But
of us
thanks for
have.
listening. Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Thanks for your support.
You're welcome. It's been fun.
Well, that's about it for everything we have this recording. Thanks for listening. Good night from Toronto. And join us again for another edition of the Anime Roundtable. I don't know what's more likely, getting to 200 or the Leafs getting out of the first round.